So, on to Ambassador Keith Harper. It is an honor to have you here, Keith. And you served as U.S. Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, Switzerland, and that was between 2014 and 2017. And you were the first Native American to receive the rank of ambassador, where you promoted and advocated for the protection of human rights around the globe on behalf of the United States. And you have a very impressive background. I'm going to read so that I don't miss out one detail. You were Senior Non-Resident Fellow on National Security at George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs, and I believe that's a current post. You're a partner at the international law firm of Kilpatrick, Townsend and Stockton, LLP. You're a member of the Cherokee Nation, and you are one of the United States' leading Native Americans, recognized by the National Law Journal as one of the 50 most influential minority lawyers in America. You previously served as Commissioner for White House Fellowships under Barack Obama. You were Chair for Native American Policy. And in the 2008 Obama for American presidential campaign, you were a member of the transition team for energy and environment. And you have taught as an adjunct professor at American University, Washington College of Law, and Catholic University, Columbus School of Law. I am almost out of breath. Such an impressive background. The purpose of the conversation today is to really learn from an expert such as yourself about the role that you see for business and human rights. But I thought we could begin with a bit of an introduction. Hearing me recite that very impressive resume, how did you actually get started in your career and on this trajectory related to human rights?
Well, first, Marcia, thanks for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here with all of you. So my journey started with, once I was at law school, having a real desire to try to move issues related to tribal communities. Between that and I had a great interest in sort of foreign affairs, international affairs, national security. And I come to the rights conversation by understanding how vitally important litigation, pursuit of rights has been for American Indians in this country and indigenous peoples worldwide. And so that's my entry point. But then I also saw the importance of it on so many other issues that I care about, whether those are women's empowerment issues, discrimination issues, racial discrimination issues, rights of LGBTI persons, et cetera. And so, but my entry point was Indian law. And so I graduated from law school, and there's not a whole lot of nexus between foreign affairs and Indian law. So I spent a good 20 years litigating on behalf of tribal communities. And then this opportunity came up to serve on a more broad view of human rights, and it's something I've always cared deeply about.
So when you were appointed as U.S. Ambassador to the Human Rights Council, what was a typical day like for you? What did you actually do in that role?
Well, the role, it really depends if we're in session or out of session. The Human Rights Council sits 3 times a year in March, June, and September. And if you're in session, it is madness for the role that I served. I mean, it's basically diplomacy from 7 in the morning till 10 at night. So you have breakfasts, lunches, dinners, receptions, all kinds of places where you're going to side events, you're delivering statements on the floor that are really important to United States equities. If you're out of session, then really your job then becomes preparing for your key initiatives. And that preparation time is absolutely essential, because if you're going to be successful in pursuing new initiatives or sustaining older initiatives, you have to do the work pre-sessionally to lay the foundation. So you participate in roundtables. Some are Chatham House rules, some are open to the public. And you're just building coalitions constantly. And of course, things are constantly erupting around the world. And when new matters erupt, then you have to respond and figure out what the best way to get the best results for key U.S. objectives is.
Would you say during your tenure there was a high point, and was there also a low point?
Yes, maybe I can identify two high points if you don't mind, because these were my favorite things. The first is that there was a process that started before I served, where a key objective of the United States was to pursue a much more robust attention to discrimination and violence against LGBTI persons. And so I wanted to, by the time I left, I wanted to make sure we had a full-time UN investigator that was looking at this issue. And so we passed one resolution that was basically asking the UN system to investigate. And then in 2016, in a very close vote and with grave opposition from Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the Russians and others, we were able to nevertheless pass a resolution that created this mandate holder. And what we know is that when you have a UN entity with the imprimatur of the UN, and it does an analysis of rights of any given group, that will over time change the conversation. We've seen that with women's rights issues. We've seen that with a whole panoply of issues. And so for me, that was one key. The second one I would identify is that, I learned early on that, that there had never been an opportunity for the Dalai Lama to participate in the UN. He had never even been in a UN building. And I thought that the Tibet issue was getting somewhat lost. And so I wanted to put some energy behind that. And in 2016, we were able to invite him, and he participated for the first time in a side event for the Human Rights Council. And I think that elevated the attention, if not long-term, at least temporarily, on those important issues. I'd say the biggest low point was during, it's still continuing, but during the inception of the conflict in Yemen. And it was getting more and more challenging. The situation on the ground, both humanitarian and human rights, was really terrible and getting worse. And just because of a whole lot of geopolitical reasons, we were not able to get a significant investigation going by the UN there. And so that was my biggest disappointment, I think.
So human rights can seem like a lofty concept. We're all familiar with the words, but it might be hard to get our head around what it actually means. So how would you define human rights?
Well, I think the term is evolving, but I think that the traditional understanding of human rights is the obligations of a state to individuals, right? Like, what do states have to do? What rules do they have to follow vis-a-vis individuals? And those individuals, and we call those the individual's rights. So the freedom of expression is really about the state not being able to stop your expression, not being able to jail you because you say certain things. Freedom of association and assembly is about your ability to assemble, to meet other people, to form organizations, and the state not to break that up. So, but I recognize also that it is an evolving concept. And now we're including other things within a rights conversation. And I think that's appropriate. I mean, I think as we get into this, as we're very much in an information age, and as we get into that information age, there are a lot of other issues that give rise, whether those are economic, social, cultural rights, in the common parlance of multilateral diplomacy, that I think we have to change our conversation about. And I think one way to do that is to have a rights conversation. One way to do that is to have a goals conversation. And I think those are both appropriate in different circumstances. And then you can have a conversation that's both rights and goals. And the reason why sometimes a goals conversation is happening, like the SDGs, is that it's seen as less threatening to countries, particularly in the global South. And if I can have a better conversation about achieving goals, then I'm going to ask, which is the most effective paradigm to have that conversation? What is going to lead to the best results? And I think that this is the time to have that conversation, because we do have the SDGs in place, which are, in my estimation, dramatically helpful in advancing a lot of these things that we care about.
So RELX as a company is about data, information, analytics, and events. And an area of focus of our 4 business areas is legal. And my colleagues at LexisNexis, Legal and Professional, have come up with a definition for the rule of law. They define that as equality under the law, so you need to have that. You need to have transparency of law, an independent judiciary, and you also need accessible legal remedy. So how do you see the rule of law fitting into this wider idea of human rights?
Well, I think rule of law issues are the sine qua non of good governance. And I also do not believe that you can have an effective institutionalized system that protects rights without strong rule of law. Rule of law, the enemy of rule of law is arbitrariness. And so I agree with that. Everything you said in that definition, that all makes sense. You need to have strong institutions. You have to have strong judiciary. You have to have a culture where it's a law. It's a country or a system of laws and not of men. And what we mean by that is that depending on your station, what results you get from the legal system should not depend on your station in life. And where you depart from that norm, I think you depart from rule of law. And where you depart from rule of law, you necessarily undermine your ability to have success politically, socially, and economically. And so when we talk about effective, sustainable development, rule of law is one of the essential components, and that's why it's highlighted so well in SDG 16.
I wanted to point out that earlier this year in January, my colleagues at LexisNexis launched the Rule of Law Foundation, a 501c3 organization to allow us to engage with other partners around the world on rule of law issues. Now, you mentioned about goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. So in 2015, 193 nations, all the UN states, were able to unanimously agree these 17 goals for the world, a kind of to-do list of what we want to achieve by 2030. I'm just going to stop and give a plug here for the RELX SDG Resource Center, which is something that we launched in 2017. It is free content from across our business as well as content from within the UN system on the SDGs. And our colleagues at LexisNexis built a news tracker where you can get up-to-the-minute news on the SDGs. And again, it's free for the world.
Great.
And in preparation for our discussion today, I decided to do a search, and I found that there are 251 results that come up on human rights and business as well. And so one of them, for example, is LexisNexis Legal and Professional, and an article and a lot of supporting information on human rights in business, an overview. And then from the UN Global Compact, we also have, because we integrate, as I say, partner content onto the site, the foundation of sustainable business as it relates to human rights. So there's some really good stuff out there. But you mentioned SDG 16, which is around peace, justice, and strong institutions. So that does lend itself when we think about the rule of law. So tell us where it fits in relation to human rights, but then also what is the human rights component underpinning the other SDGs? Yeah,
so certainly 16 is critical. But I would emphasize that the SDGs are integrated, and they work. In my estimation, they will work, in my estimation, if we put enough energy behind them, because of that integration and because ultimately they're mutually reinforcing. So you have rights in a number of different places. And so, for example, 5, which is about women's empowerment, what we know, what the data indicates is that if you want to have a prosperous country, if you want to grow your GDP, if you want to be successful in your sustainable development efforts, you must get rights of women correct. You have to. That's what the data indicates. And when I say rights of women, I mean women's empowerment in business. I mean access to capital. I mean, rights of girls to equal education. I mean, addressing violence against women. And when you do those things, then what we have seen is that you have laid the appropriate precondition for successful sustainable development. And where you fail to do those things, you've completely undermined your capability to do so. So 5 has rights connotations, certainly 16, a number of other places as well. And I just think it's embedded throughout the notion. But it's interesting because it's also a goals conversation about rights issues. And I think that that's okay. Because I think that, again, for some countries, having a goals conversation can be a much more healthy conversation for them because it does not feel like we're trying to be targeted and saying they're not doing certain things, whereas it's a common everything. I'd also say one more thing. Since the 1980s, even before, but definitely since the Right to Development Declaration in the 80s, there has been a really challenging conversation between development and rights, in part because of this concept of right to development, where Western states saw it as basically saying, you must give us some of your resources, irrespective of how well we'll use those for our own development efforts. And so it's just been this unhealthy conversation under the right to development rubric. And I think what the SDGs do is it brings the entire world together. As you mentioned, virtually every nation backed the SDGs. And so now we all agree to a certain set of precepts and a certain set of ways in which, if we implement successfully by 2030, we will have achieved many of the objectives on the development front. But again, as it's articulated well in the Vienna Declaration, development and rights and human rights are not enemies of one another. They're mutually reinforcing, so that we can recognize that building stronger institutions takes development. And if you have better institutions, you are better able to observe human rights. But it's also true that if you protect human rights, you will have laid the foundation for greater development. And so that in that way, the SDGs allow us to have this healthy conversation, and so this is a critical time. I'm so glad to see this card of yours, because I'm a firm believer in this process. I think that the United States should play a leadership role in making sure that the entirety of the SDGs is implemented.
On your point about SDG 5 and gender equality, I heard Lisa Kingo, who is the CEO of the United Nations Global Compact, that business initiative I was mentioning earlier, say last evening that it's going to take another 200 years at our current trajectory to reach gender equality. So clearly there's work to be done.
Yeah, absolutely.
When I think about the genesis of the SDGs, so it started in 2000 with the Millennium Development Goals, the 7th UN Secretary General, Kofi Annan, and the world coming together to say, we need to have 8 Millennium Development Goals that we can focus on. They were very much focused for the Global South. Mm-hmm. The thing for me, that's very important about the SDGs, it's for everyone, it's for every state. But when we think about human rights, it's very easy to say, well, that's for them. We, for example, in the Global North, we know how to do this, it's not an issue. To that kind of dichotomy between Global North and Global South as it relates to human rights, what do you see as the interconnection? Well,
first, I totally agree with you that one of the benefits of the SDGs is it's a recognition that we all can do better on development issues. And what occurs too often in the Global North, in the West, is that you have growing income inequality, such that you have communities that are just being left behind. And sometimes this has a racial undertone as well. If you look at the Special Rapporteur on Poverty's report in the United States, it's pretty harrowing that we have these communities in the richest country in the world that have struggled for their entire history and continue to struggle because of the legacies of our history. And so the hope is that instead of having sort of a position from hubris that we don't have any problems, my hope is that we can have a broader global conversation about what is needed in each place. And I think if you look at the SDGs, there are things that are needed intrastate, domestically in global north countries, whereas you have more widespread concerns in some global south countries. But I think it just leads the main thing is it allows for a healthier conversation. And what we know is that when the UN system does best is when it establishes a conceptual framework in which it can bring nations together. Because that way we don't have these, oh, is it global south, is it global north? It's everybody coming together to address issues that are important to all. And of course, the most important of those issues is going to be climate change because it's existential, and that affects everybody.
So you've mentioned a lot about states and the role of states as a framework for addressing human rights. But what about the role for business? Because it could be easy for us to say, we're going to look to our national institutions to set the framework, and that's very important, perhaps within this larger framework of the Sustainable Development Goals. But when you dig down, what do businesses, is this something that they need to be focusing on, and how?
Absolutely, businesses need to be focused on this. And the good news is that many businesses are focused on this. I just looked during my tenure at the change of the Business and Human Rights Forum in Geneva, the participation rates, the conversations, what issues they're seeking to address, what commitments are being made. And I think it was watershed, and that was just in a 3-year period. And I think that will continue to occur. And because what businesses recognize, it seems to me, is that they want a world that is stable. They want a world that is prosperous. They want a world that is secure. And if you're going to be effective in doing business, if you're going to be successful, those are preconditions. And to the extent that we have a less stable world, a less secure world, where we have conflicts that are breaking out, that's not a prosperous world. And so businesses understand that they have to be part of the rights conversation. If you're a tech company and there is an issue regarding where's the line of what is allowed online and what is not allowed online, well, you got to be a part of that conversation. It goes to your business model. If you're in a different sector, then you have to figure out what are the issues in that particular business sector. The Ruggie principles, which is the business and human rights principles that were adopted by the Human Rights Council, I think are a great guide. But what has to happen now, and what is happening now, is that we have to go sector by sector and get more granular so people understand what are the specific rules. I will say, there's oftentimes this dialogue that is very anti-negative about business. You hear it here and there, but particularly among progressives. I will say that most of the companies that I have met with and dealt with want to do the right thing. They also want to have an understanding of what the rules of the road are and what are the expectations. And so to me, business participation in that dialogue and business participation in forcing sometimes governments to do the right thing is absolutely essential in this globalized world.
I should say that at RELX, we definitely prioritize human rights in our code of ethics, which is a guide to our individual and our corporate behavior, and also within our supply chain. So we need to think about what's happening both downstream and upstream. So it's something that's ongoing in terms of assessing risk in our supply chain, for example, and making sure that we are engaging with suppliers that are in business areas that could be seen to be higher risk or that they're operating in high-risk locations. Mm-hmm. So it's an ongoing process of trying to make sure that we have a sightline of the places and the parts of our business that are most exposed to human rights. And you mentioned the Ruggie framework, these UN principles on human rights. That's something that's been very important to us and will continue to be as we go forward. Mm-hmm. When you are an employee in our company, we're 30,000 people plus around the world, human rights can seem very far out there for me. If I want to anchor that down and think about what that means to me as an employee operating in our company, how can I do that?
You know, I think it comes down to what kind of world do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a world where every person has human dignity, irrespective of they're less socioeconomically well off or better socioeconomically well off, whether they're white, black, Latino, what have you, whether they're gay or straight? That is the construct for me. It's about dignity. And I think everybody has an obligation to care about human dignity. And I think your RELX has done an admirable job of integrating these concepts within the entire company. And I think that's been recognized. And so for me, the best way to have that conversation is to say, don't you want systems, governments, companies to treat every human being with dignity? And if the answer to that is yes, then the things that we're doing sort of emerge from that conversation.
Well, I would say at RELX, our unique contributions as a business are a kind of guiding force for us, which we articulate as universal sustainable access to information, protecting society, looking at the rule of law and access to justice, fostering communities, and rule of law. These things are very important to us, and we find a way to integrate that. And as I've heard my CEO say, it's a reason that we as employees want to get out of bed every day and come to work for our company, because this is something that is integral to the value and the positive impact that we have on society. Now, we have to be very careful and aware of the negative impact of operating our business, as all businesses do, and that's something that's ongoing. You mentioned a kind of confluence of factors and the interest that states have, the interest that individual employees have, but I was thinking about a stakeholder group, investors. NGOs, we know, are very good at holding companies to account. They are kind of moral compass. I think that's very useful. But why should investors care about what companies do on human rights?
Because I think that ultimately human rights is part of an international rules-based order. The set of rules that the United States has led on since the founding of the UN in the aftermath of the Second World War. And that order is about how nations should follow a set of rules. One critically important one is territorial integrity, that one nation should not invade another country. And that is a bright line rule. It gets breached, to be sure, but it's a bright line rule. And as part of that system, human rights is a core component, because it's about how do you maintain internal stability in countries. And if you don't observe human rights, if you utterly fail to do so, then you're either going to have undermined completely your ability to develop, i.e. North Korea, or you're going to have a situation where the governance isn't at a place where you can have sustainable development. And from a business perspective, from even an investor's perspective, they should, I think you can make the business case for why, to the extent that we have this international rules-based order with human rights being a key component of it, you are going to be able to have more opportunities to grow your business worldwide. And it seems to me that investors should care about that. So you can make a business case for it. I think also, if you look at some of the issues, investors should have the same moral responsibility all of us have to want to treat other human beings with dignity. So not only is there a business case to be made, I think there is a moral obligation case to be made.
As a practitioner, I definitely have seen this agenda rise higher, because we see investors increasingly ask us about our ESG criteria. So our environmental performance, our social performance, which human rights fits into, and underpins, as well as the governance of our organization. And I think it also is a trend that we're seeing more legislation that relates to human rights in the United Kingdom, where we are headquartered. We're subject to the Modern Slavery Act.
Mm-hmm.
And it is incumbent on every company over $44 million in turnover to have on their homepage, or a link from their homepage, a statement of how they are avoiding modern slavery in their direct operations and also in their supply chain. So governments as well are catching up, I think, on this agenda. So the Atomic Energy Commission, I think, has something called the Doomsday Clock, where it tells you where you are before midnight and how great the risk might be of having a nuclear incident involving states. If we could imagine a doomsday clock for human rights, where do you think the world is right now?
It's a tough question. I think we're closer to midnight than we have been in a long time. And I think that that's that there has been a failure of leadership in too many places around the world. There's been a failure to hold autocrats accountable, and so that they have felt open to attacking rights defenders, undermining basic civil and human rights, freedom of expression, freedom of association, assembly, freedom of religion and belief. And so I don't know how, it's a hard question. I don't know how close, but I do think we need to rectify it in short order. And I think part of this is that traditionally the United States has had important leadership in pursuing and advocating for rights. Whether we participate in one form or another, we've always been at the forefront of that. And I think we've seen a retreat. And so you can conceptualize rights differently. The Chinese have a different concept of rights, for example. They see it as sub-sovereign, which is not the way we have traditionally thought about it. And so we're having this battle of how to define rights as well. And then of course, you know, all of this conversation when we're talking about the doomsday clock should be viewed, all aspects of life should be viewed with an understanding of where we are vis-a-vis climate change, because that is the one thing that, you know, I worry about most, because I think we've sort of collectively stuck our heads in the sand for too long. And we're getting to that point where it may be irreversible. So I worry about that as well, because that's, whether you're talking about rights or however you want to construct that assessment, that is the conversation of our age, I think.
And is there anything that you see going forward in terms of what the future of human rights looks like for business, for states?
Sure. I think we need to, the United States and the State Department has been resistant to have the conversation about economic rights. And I think we're at that point where if we don't address the growing delta in too many countries between rich and poor, that's constantly getting more difficult, then I think we're going to really we've already seen how it's affected our politics in the West, and I think it's just going to affect it to a much more greater degree. And so I think we have to ask ourselves how we have that economic rights conversation. And you hear it, you know, you hear various candidates on various campaign trails, whether in the United States and others, talking about these terms. I don't have the answer for it, but what I do know is that we have to address it. And to me, that is a natural fit for where companies can contribute to a conversation. How do we have these conversations about economic rights that is fair? You know, I know there's been some criticism of it, but I love the John Rawls, the sort of Rawlsian sense of what is just, right? Which is, if none of us in this room were born yet, what would the world look like if we wanted a fair world, where you didn't know what your station life, you didn't know if you're going to be an earl or a poor kid in a barrio. And if you look at it from that sense, then I think that the world that we have, where we have this greater inequality, is not a world that we can consider sufficiently fair. And fairness is to me a necessary, a sense of fairness by individuals and collectively is a necessary precondition for successful governance and support. And so I think that there is a critical role for businesses to advance the conversation of how we address economic rights, and that conversation should happen now. I mean, it is already happening, but we should double our efforts there.
So I'm coming down to my last two questions before I invite the audience to ask some of their own. And I wanted to ask you about your perspective as a Native American. And you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation how that perspective and practical work as a lawyer was what kind of launched you on this path that you've been on through your career. But is there anything more that you want to say about the kind of ethos that you have as a Native American related to a rights conversation?
You know, I just see, you know, really, if I look at U.S. history, and there's, of course, really dark phases with respect to tribal communities, particularly my tribe, Cherokee Nation, was one of the Trail of Tears. We were the principal chair of Trail of Tears tribe, where we were moved forcefully from Georgia and the Carolinas to Oklahoma. And if I ask myself, how did that change to a place now where Indian tribes still have some significant challenges, but we're far better off today than we were a decade ago. We're far better off a decade ago than we were a decade prior to that. I mean, think about it. In the 1920s census, there were about 360,000, I think, Native Americans left in this country. And now we're probably going to be in the 4 or 5 million range. So just on pure numbers, if you look at economic success, if you look at better governance and institutional capacity, on so many levels, we've just improved. And the reason that is because of rights advocacy. Starting in the 30s, but expanding dramatically in the 70s, where this notion of tribal communities should have a right to self-determination. They should have a right to self-governance. And that set the foundation for these improvements. And so over the past 50 years, we've seen all these dramatic improvements. And I think of the challenges that we continue to deal with today. You know, we have an epidemic level of violence against Indigenous women and girls. And that's both here in the United States and in Canada, but that's also true around the world. It's almost in every country, if you have a significant Indigenous population, that Indigenous women and girls are going to be the highest level of violence against them. And that's because perpetrators often go free, because they're devalued in the society. There's a whole plethora of reasons. So it, in my estimation, has been this rights conversation that has been the most successful one in addressing the challenges the tribal communities have faced, and indeed Indigenous communities in other countries have faced. And so I can see how having a focus on rights and energy behind rights from business, from governments, from NGOs, from the full panoply of society can serve to the greater good. And so I try to look at that and look at other issues, whether it's poverty or climate change, and see how do we have that conversation in an effective way. Thank
you. Keith, what question should I have asked you that I didn't ask you?
This is always the toughest question, by the way. Let's see. Maybe what are the biggest global challenges? Is that the things I worry most about? I worry about the deterioration of rights at a time when autocrats are on the rise. I worry about the United States retreat at a time when there are challenges to the global human rights system. I'm deeply concerned about North Korea. I'm very concerned about the transatlantic alliance and its deterioration. NATO has been a core, key component of stability, and I worry about the work that will be done to resuscitate the State Department as a global player. At the same time, I would say that in general, I am cautiously optimistic, because I think that this period of time that we've experienced over the last, I don't know, 5-6 years around the world, populism and autocracy, I think it is also creating a situation that of people recognizing that these things do not bring them the society that they want. And I think that's a good lesson learned, because I think sometimes societies forget what it looks like to live under such conditions. So overall, I'm optimistic, but there's a lot of things that I think I worry about. And I would just say that finally, that we have also been, we also have this gift of the SDGs, which I will tell you, I was hopeful we would get to an agreement. I was not particularly confident that we would. And I think the fact that you can get so many countries to agree on these principles with such competing interests says a lot about when we have when we have identified an objective, and we have and we understand how important it is to get right, we can achieve things, and that has laid the foundation for, I think, a better future.